Are you a seven-figure practice owner that wants to do more without burning out? Join us for the Seven-Figure Practice Retreat, a luxury mastermind where high-level practice owners step away from the day-to-day to build systems, strategy, and freedom in the Dominican Republic. This February, spots are limited, so apply now, and our sponsors are covering 95% of the cost over at practiceofthepractice.com/7. Again, that's practiceofthepractice.com/7. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 1273. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast, where we help you build a thriving private practice that you absolutely love. We want both sides of that. We want you to thrive. We want you to rock out private practice. And that's often through learning things we never learned in grad school, things about management, things about business, things about marketing, just the stuff that most clinical programs don't include. And then also we want you to love it. We want you to have that heart. We want you to have your ideal clients, to build the kind of business that you can stand behind. And we're really just coming alongside you as guides, as co-learners, to be with you in this process. So that's why I just love doing the show, to being able to, now 5 days a week, just discuss big picture matters with people, and also the micro. We get into some micro things as well. And that's why today I'm so excited to have Colin M. Fisher with me. Dr. Fisher is a professor, an author, speaker, and occasional jazz trumpet player. He's the author of the book, The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. Colin's an associate professor of organizations and innovation and PhD program director at University College London's School of Management. Drawing on his experience as a professional jazz trumpet player with the Grammy-nominated Ether Orchestra, his research has uncovered how groups navigate complex decisions, collaborate effectively, and produce creative breakthroughs. Colin earned his PhD in organizational behavior from Harvard University, originally from Washington in the U.S. He now lives in Northeast London with his wife and 2 children. He can sometimes be found performing at jazz jams throughout London. Colin, welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I heard that, I can jam on the piano with my daughters, and I also played saxophone all through like 5th through 12th grade, and did like alto, tenor, bari, all of it. But improvising music on the saxophone never clicked for me. Like the whole knowing the scales well enough. Whereas there's something about seeing it on the piano that it's really easy for me to see all the different chords and stuff. And so just hearing a jazz musician, I'm just starting from a place of jealousy.
Well, I mean, I hope everyone feels like they can and they are welcome to improvise on whatever instrument they can, and that it's not about knowing scales or anything like that. Hopefully it's much more a way of speaking and communication and expression, and that we don't feel too bound by those knowledge constraints of what we do or we don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think people often categorize artsy people in one category and organizational behavior people that get a Harvard degree maybe in another. Tell me about those worlds coming together in Colin.
Yeah, so that's a great way of putting it. I always would say I was probably the most studious, conscientious jazz musician you knew, and the most flaky, all over the place business school PhD student that you might ever know. So I definitely it was 2 different worlds, and it was a big adjustment from coming from the world of jazz to suddenly walking into these business school classes and having to kind of figure out what was going on and adjust my personality. But the kind of impetus of being really curious about how groups can work together better, about how we can kind of get this spontaneous creativity from, often a group of strangers. And that curiosity, I think, did run very clearly from people who were involved with jazz to people who study organizations and organizing, and just how is it that human beings can kind of behave in social situations in ways that lead to the kind of outcomes, socially or instrumentally that we want, that people were curious about that in both places. So I think it wasn't that hard in the sense that like that deep curiosity about how we do this runs through both communities very strongly.
Yeah. Well, tell me how kind of management of groups or businesses, how has that influenced your jazz, and how has jazz influenced kind of the management of groups?
I think the jazz has a lot of lessons for organizations and especially for people who are working in these small groups and teams. And one of those lessons is really about the importance of structure and roles in kind of work in our work. That what makes jazz special, I think, isn't always the kind of like magic high end of the greatest albums ever, although there's a lot to learn there. But that from a day-to-day level, what's interesting in jazz is when you get a bunch of competent jazz musicians together, that even if we've never talked, even I've been on stages where we couldn't speak the same language, but I know if I go autumn leaves, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, everything will be fine. Like we won't fall apart. And that kind of coordination comes from these minimal structures that we all know, that that we have this kind of scaffolding that allows reliable coordination that, I think all businesses are really jealous of, that they look at it and go, well, how is it that, they're able to do this stuff spontaneously? And the lessons really are about the kind of discipline and the kind of preparation and the kind of strong norms throughout the community that allow us to have this kind of really flexible structure where everybody feels like they can be creative, they can do a bunch of flexible things, and yet we still have this baseline where we're not going to fall apart, where we can coordinate with one another really, really reliably. So I think from that situation, it makes me really attuned to thinking about what is that kind of analog for that in the work teams that I see, whether it's the work teams I'm on or the work teams that I'm working with in organizations. And what is it that they need to be doing to build that kind of culture on one side, structures on another side, and then that kind of deep knowledge and expertise within people.
I love that it's structure, roles, and knowledge. Even just knowing you've got your drummer keeping the beat, your bass line and then having kind of the dance that happens between the musicians, and just thinking about that as a metaphor for the business world of like, what are the things that keep us together, that we often talk about, keeping the plates spinning, the things that are bringing in the money. You've got to keep the counseling going. And then what's the spaghetti at the wall that we're going to try some new things that we don't know if they're going to work. We might launch e-courses. We might launch a podcast, but we can't just drop the bass line and the drum beat, the thing that's kind of bringing in the money for the practice. Now, I know in the Collective Edge, you really delve into how groups shape our behavior and decisions, and often even without our own awareness around that. Can you dig into a little bit more about how groups are shaping behavior, decisions, and even our awareness doesn't realize how that's happening?
I mean, groups are shaping everything, everywhere. They shape, even when there's no group around us, that the way we think about our membership in groups is still shaping our behavior. And I'm sure, as therapists and people who are delving into people's psychology, I don't have to tell you guys how strongly how we think of ourselves affects how we behave across situations. So on one level, there's people's identification with groups and how they think of themselves, whether they think of themselves as, the drummer or the bass player or the whatever it may be. That's having one kind of effect. But then when we're in different group situations, we are conformity-seeking creatures on one level. And there's kind of this paradox in human behavior where we deeply want to feel like we belong, like we fit in, like we're accepted. And at the same time, we want to stand out from the crowd and be seen and be acknowledged by the groups of which we're a member. And the part that happens, I think, that we're less aware of is often that conformity-seeking part of ourselves. And it's really easy to understand if you kind of think back to where the time our brains evolved, why ostracism was such a huge issue for our brains. And it's like, if there's any sign a group might be wanting to kick us out, that was a matter of life or death for our sort of hunter-gatherer ancestors. So for us today, though, we take these very tiny signs that we might be ostracized and we really overweight them in our behavior today. And that's why, when we're in a meeting and somebody says something we disagree with, maybe we don't express that disagreement. We sort of say, I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to be the one who stands out and says something that might meet with the disapproval of my peers. Even if I think it's right, even if I think it's important, I may still not say it. And that tendency is what, most of my job is spent fighting, where we're saying, all right, we've got a group of people in the room. They've got different perspectives. They know interesting stuff. They've got, they potentially great ideas. And yet over and over, we see these meetings where people don't share that. They don't say what they're thinking. They don't say what they know. They don't say what they really think. And that what we're in the business of doing is sort of overcoming our brain's natural aversion to anything that might meet with social disapproval and building what Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety, this shared sense that it's okay to take these interpersonal risks. And I think that is a lot like therapy. I work a lot with coaches as well, and that I think that's something that these industries that have to do with getting people to really talk about what they really think and what they really feel know a lot about. But in your average business meeting, that's not what we have, right? We've got a situation where people are worried about hierarchy, they're worried about politics, they're worried about offending people, and often those worries aren't conscious. And so, when we hear somebody express an opinion in a work context, the tendency is just to kind of agree and not sort of look for ways for us to disagree. But what groups are really powerful for and where they make better decisions, where they're able to come up with things that are more creative than individual, is where they do disagree and where they can have these differences and they can actually build on the differences between us in order to come up with something that no one of us would have known or thought of on our own.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much of that is on the individual to work on their emotional intelligence outside of work, and how much do you think it needs to be facilitated by the owner or a manager or supervisor to create that group environment where that feels safe? Because sometimes I feel like we over-therapize the work world where, it's like, like we're just digging in too much. But then in other areas, it's like we want to create that safe environment where people can disagree because that makes the business better. It makes the environment better. Mm-hmm. So that individual versus the collective, where do you see some of that responsibility falling?
I mean, I think, in an ideal world, we're doing everything we possibly can to improve. But at least my take is that people find individualistic explanations and solutions more appealing than collective ones. And that when you're given a choice between, reading a book about how you can make yourself better and one that how you can make your group or your team or your organization better, most people are choosing the individual one. And that there's a lot of things in our psychology that lead us to want to explain the world in terms of these individualistic explanations. That social psychologists call it the fundamental attribution error, where we're much more likely to attribute, especially other people's behavior, to their traits and their personality and say, oh, you're not emotionally intelligent enough. And that's the problem in this group. And that we underweight the role of the situation, the incentives in the organization, the fact that, there's someone in authority or high status person who has been discouraging of new ideas or questions, that the overall culture of the organization isn't receptive to that. And so we tend to overemphasize the role of personality in overcoming these problems, and we tend to underweight the role of structure. So I think if there's a choice, and often there's not really a choice, we could do both, right, in the situation that you're talking about. But I would say part of why I really wrote this book was because I think people don't have a language to think about these group influences, and they really don't have a lens to understand group behavior because it's so invisible to us that we're so likely to default to a story with a hero and a villain where, the hero's story of personal change is the kind of motivating factor in understanding why this is going to turn out well. But the reality is it's often the, more invisible work of who got invited into the room in the first place. How did that decision get made? Who decided what the task was? Who decided what the goal was? How did that get communicated? Is it getting repeated consistently, or did people kind of forget and develop their own discrepant ideas about what it is we're trying to achieve here? And it's this kind of work that is more at the collective level. It's saying, it's not about what I think. It's about how what I think compares to what everybody else thinks. And do we have a shared understanding of the things we need a shared understanding of? Like going back to our conversation about jazz, are we playing the same song? And then we can really be creative and we can offer some different ideas. But if we're not playing the same song, then it's going to be really hard for us to collaborate and communicate. And that's where a lot of these group problems end up happening. And all the emotional intelligence in the world isn't going to make up for the fact that people just have two different ideas about what the point of this group even is.
I love that. I want to thank Headway for sponsoring this episode. If you run a group practice, you know that accepting insurance can be overwhelming. Between credentialing, billing, and payroll, the admin side can easily take over your week. Headway was built to help you handle this, and they're the only platform designed specifically for in-network group practices. Whether you're growing your team or running an established practice, Headway makes the business side easier with faster credentialing, higher per-session rates, and bi-weekly payments your team can count on. They work with therapy, psychiatric, and hybrid group practices. There are no subscription fees, just the support you need to run your practice with ease. Run your best group practice with Headway, trusted by thousands of group practice leaders to simplify insurance admin and reach more people through in-network care. Curious how Headway can work for you? Head to join.headway.co/Joe. That's join.headway.co/Joe to learn more. It makes me think about your new Harvard Business Review article, Are You Really a Good Listener? I would love to hear, how are people bad listeners in the work world?
Yeah, it was really fun to kind of dig into research on listening, which rightly is getting more attention as this essential skill. But that it's hard in the work world because we've got a lot of pressures on us. And that I think what goes under-acknowledged in the kind of new discourse about how important it is for leaders to be good listeners and to listen to their employees, which I want to say, yes, it is. Absolutely, they should. But that if we put all the pressure to listen to, 5, 10, 20, 100 people onto one person, that's kind of overlooking how costly it is to listen, especially when people are telling you really hard problems, and that a lot of leaders at work are not trained, and this may be somewhere where we do need some emotional training for leaders to deal with the kind of volume of largely, negatively valenced stuff that they're hearing. People are telling them about their problems. They're suggesting changes that would be hard to make in the organization. And so the costs and the barriers here are about, one, time, that you're telling leaders they're supposed to listen, but we're not telling them it's hard. And so they're not allocating very much time to it. They've got this one, 30-minute meeting with you to hear about all your problems. And when that 30-minute meeting's over, they've got to run off and talk to somebody else because they've got a whole bunch of people to talk to. And so haste ends up being a big barrier where we've got these time limits. We're asking people to share things that often are quite personal to them. But because of these time limits, a lot of leaders are kind of rushing through, and that may end up making people feel worse than if you hadn't had the meeting at all. If you feel like somebody's trying to get away, that they don't really have time to give you their full attention, that's one big barrier. And then, as I said, a lot of what people are being told in these meetings for leaders are difficult things to hear. And so leaders, when they're being told something needs to change, that their followers aren't having good experiences, it's really easy to get defensive in those situations. And so defensiveness is another big barrier that we see, and it's often coupled with the fact that we have time limits on these meetings. So we use in the article, we use the example of a town hall meeting where at the very end, a really difficult issue came up. And the CEO, the meeting was almost over. It was clear she wanted to kind of get it over with and said, don't ask me about that, and got really defensive. And I think that was quite related to the fact it was the end of the meeting. So these kinds of dynamics operate in tandem. And so we see leaders, because they're under all these pressures to both listen, but they're not given a way to structure that listening in such a way that, one, it's not all one person's responsibility. It's not the CEO's responsibility to listen to all, hundreds or thousands of people in the organization, because that's going to lead to this really superficial listening. And a big thing we saw in the literature was this increase in CEO town halls and CEO listening tours that would have the effect of, looking like they were just window dressing, where it was clear the leader knew they were supposed to look like they were listening, and they were looking for these shortcuts to give this appearance. And so that was another one of the barriers we saw, which was just this lack of follow-through, where you'd have this town hall, people would bring up some really difficult problems, and then no one would hear what would happen as a result, that there wouldn't be any changes. And so we talk a lot about the importance of closing the loop, closing this listening loop. When you hear a problem, you acknowledge that, but then it's not enough in this one conversation in most business situations. You need to say, well, something's going to change later as a result of this. And so that needs to be communicated, or if you can't change something, you need to be telling people, hey, I heard you, but here's why we can't do that right now. So these were some of the barriers that we really saw as we dug into this issue of listening, and especially listening for organizational leaders.
Now, I know you've looked at, decades of research around just groups and how they shape our thoughts and behaviors. Is there a research study or two that really stands out to you, or things you've observed that maybe personally shifted your thinking around groups?
So I think a couple of the things that really changed my own behavior and how I lead teams. One was research I did about helping in organizations, and that I have one paper where we were looking at designers and how they give help to each other, and that help is something that I think, as we have organizations that are less hierarchical, that there's the roles are a little bit more flexible, and they're trying to do really interesting creative work, that lack of role definition, that lack of hierarchy creates new challenges, but it puts a lot of emphasis on helping one another, that's how a lot of the important work gets done. And so what we saw was this really deeper form of help that wasn't just, hey, can you lend me this pen? Hey, can you, do me this small favor? But that people who were really, these helping incidents would turn into deeper collaborations. But the biggest problem that we saw was really simple misunderstandings that happen when we have these kind of informal interactions that are outside of our roles. And the reason that's tough is because now it's not clear who's responsible for what. That when I say, yeah, I'm going to help you, but that's not really my job. Like, what am I willing to do and what am I not willing to do? And that turned out to be a really hard conversation to have when you're asking somebody for help. Because, it's a favor on some level, right? You're saying, hey, can you help me? And that it's not polite in our culture to then say, well, actually tell me exactly what you are willing to do and what you're not willing to do and the timeline on which you're willing to do it. And so we'd get a lot of these misunderstandings once organizations were relying more on help because people weren't willing to have those conversations. So the way that's changed my behavior is when I'm asking, whether it's asking for informal help or I'm delegating things or I'm trying, that I'm much more clear about what I want. And I'm not going to say, hey, can you take a look at this? Can you help me? I'm going to say, hey, here's where I think I am in this project. Here's the kind of feedback that I'm hoping I'm going to get. But of course, if you think of something else, you're welcome to offer that. And here's the kind of timeline this would be most useful to me on. If you can't do it, no worries. But this is when I'm going to have to move on. And so it's kind of breaking some of these social norms about what's okay when you're just asking for help in the halls and being more clear, because getting helpful help turns out to be really important in a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that the people I study and advise do.
It's so interesting when I see all these kind of different ways that people think, different kind of typical departments in a college. And when things are discovered that are so similar, I even think about couples work. And it's like, if someone comes in and they just want to be affirmed, they just want to vent, and they don't want action from their partner or why they screwed up or what they should have done different, to go into that and saying, help looks like I just want to vent right now and I want a shoulder massage while I do it. That's going to be much different than someone saying, oh, I had a terrible day at work. And then your partner saying, well, did you snap at them again? Or like, did you try this? And they get all problem solving. And so I think that it's interesting how even what you're talking about is like couples work 101. And it's just so funny to see how, sometimes we forget the therapist in us as the business owner. And so I think it's great that you're kind of bringing us back to a lot of these skills as therapists we have inside of us. It's just applying it a little bit differently within our private practice. Colin, the last question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
I think what I'd like people to know is groups are not as mysterious as they may seem. And that groups are mostly a kind of manifestation of these structural conditions that are put into place ahead of time. And I think, I often kind of use a gardening metaphor with thinking about groups. And that if you, sow a bunch of seeds in really terrible soil with no sunlight and you don't water it, you can't be surprised when, plants are struggling to grow there. But that if you have, a great, rich soil and a sunny spot that's well watered and ventilated and everything else, then, you're probably going to be able to grow almost anything there. And the groups are really similar in that if you get the structure right, if you compose your teams carefully, you give them goals that are well suited to group work, you give them tasks that are things that groups tend to be good at, which do tend to be more complicated tasks and not simple repetitive stuff, then humans are smart and aware, and they're likely to be able to problem solve their way out of it. But if you mess any of those things up, it's very, very difficult to kind of solve those problems with the sort of coaching and interpersonal skill building don't compensate for these kind of lack of structure. So I think it's mostly trying to draw people's attention back to these kind of initial conditions that groups are forming under, and how that affects their development.
So awesome. Well, Colin, if people want to get your book, if they want to read that new Harvard Business Review article, where should we send them?
So you can find everything I'm up to at colinmfisher.com, and that'll have ways to get the book, ways to get all the wonderful other writing that I'm trying to do to help people out.
So awesome. Colin, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe.
I love that idea of structure, roles, and knowledge. Just thinking about jazz. The Jazz Tent at Jazz Fest in New Orleans is one of my favorite places to just sit and have a book. And, it's one of the coolest places at that festival because it has misters and chairs. And, just thinking about that structure, that, people come in knowing that structure of a song, and they know their roles, but they also have knowledge. And so, to me, as you go into your private practice, just think through those things. Like, what are you doing to build more structure so people know, like, what are we doing here? Like, what is the song? What is the expectation? What are people's roles within that? Are they just kind of playing the steady bass line, or are they improvising a little bit? And then, are people competent? Do they have the knowledge to actually do what they're being put into? Asking yourself, are the right people in the right seats? That book Traction is one that's been really impactful for our team to really reevaluate, okay, certain people's skill sets can thrive way differently if they're in a different seat. And so just thinking through all of that. Also, this weekend I was hanging out with one of my best friends, and he's starting a group practice, and he's been using Headway, and he was raving about it. And I told him, hey, they're one of our newer sponsors. And so, if you're looking to run your best group practice, you're going to want to do it with Headway. They're trusted by thousands of group practice leaders to simplify insurance administration and reach more people through in-network care. If you're wondering how to get started, head over to join.headway.co/Joe. Again, that's join.headway.co/Joe. Also, we have the 7-Figure Practice Retreat in the Dominican Republic in February. Headway is one of our co-sponsors with that. They're actually helping cover the entire cost of the all-inclusive that we're staying at. So would love for you to join me if you are a 7-figure practice owner. You can apply for that over at practiceofthepractice.com/7. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.